con nosotros el señor Alex Epstein, que nos acompaña en la mesa acá, en la primera mesa. Voy a darles una descripción del señor Epstein y luego él va a pasar a hacer su presentación. Alex Epstein es un filósofo y experto en energía que defiende el desarrollo de la prosperidad de los seres humanos. Debe ser el principio medular del progreso de la industria del medio ambiente. Fundó el Centro para el Progreso Industrial en el 2011 para ofrecer una alternativa positiva y prohumana al movimiento verde. Epstein es autor del Caso Moral para los Combustibles Fósiles, lo que estaba viendo en la pantalla, que es un bestseller del New York Times que argumenta que, si miramos la figura completa, el desarrollo de la prosperidad humana requiere que se consuman más combustibles fósiles y no menos. El libro ha sido ampliamente aclamado como el argumento más persuasivo que jamás haya hecho respecto a nuestro consumo continuo de combustibles fósiles, otorgándole a Epstein el premio del pensador más original en 2014 del grupo McLaughlin. Epstein es conocido por su voluntad de debatir con quien sea en cualquier momento. Ha debatido públicamente con organizaciones ambientalistas como Greenpeace, Sierra Club y 350.org sobre la moralidad de los combustibles fósiles versus sus propias agendas. Ha expuesto respecto al tema del uso de los combustibles fósiles en docenas de campos, incluyendo Harvard, Yale, Stanford y Duke, que es su alma mater. Él también se ha dirigido a empleadores y líderes en docenas de empresas de energía del Fortune 500, incluyendo ExxonMobil, Chevron, Philips y algunas otras más. En sus discursos de trabajo de consultoría, él ayuda a compañías a adoptar e implementar su mensaje pro-humano para neutralizar opositores y convertir a los no partidarios y partidarios en campeones. Uno de sus principales objetivos es enseñar a los líderes de la industria de combustibles fósiles, en el marco de la hostilidad de los medios y la academia, a entender el valor de lo que hacen y cómo comunicarlo. Nos parece sumamente interesante escuchar al señor Epstein. Lo dejo con él unos minutos. Muchas gracias. Alex, por favor.
So at your table, you should see a bunch of pins that say, "I love fossil fuels." I'm wearing one right now. So one of my goals today is to get those of you who might feel uncomfortable now wearing such a pin to proudly wear it on your way out and throughout the rest of your days and weeks and months. Now, my goal beyond that is that at some point, if you come to share the way that I've come to think about fossil fuels, you'll ultimately be willing to wear this. So the context for this was there was something called the People's Climate March in September of 2014 in the United States, and this was the biggest anti-fossil fuel march in history. And there were 100,000 protesters of fossil fuels and one supporter. So they were marching, so I stood up in the middle of the crowd. I walked into the middle of it and faced them and then started sharing with them some of the arguments that I'm going to share with you today. So one of the questions I get pretty much everywhere I go, but certainly there, is why are you here? If you're not serious, you don't love fossil fuels. And they'll often have guesses as to why I'm wearing this pin or this shirt or holding that kind of sign. And one guess is, oh, you must be from the industry or paid off by the industry. And in fact, when I came to these ideas, I was not only very poor, but I never even met anyone in the industry. Or they'll say, well, maybe you came from a place that has a... Someone doesn't like my speech. Okay, so another thing would be, well, you must come from a family or a region. Maybe you grew up in West Virginia with coal, or Texas with oil and gas. And in fact, I grew up in the DC area, which is one of the most anti-fossil fuel places you can imagine. I guess the rest of the world is pretty much like DC when it comes to fossil fuels, so maybe you can imagine. But I certainly heard nothing positive about fossil fuels for the first 22 years of my life. But there was something in my background that I think made it inevitable that I would come up with this idea called the moral case for fossil fuels, which is the idea that humanity should actually, going forward, be using more fossil fuels, not less. And that is that my background was in, and still is in, philosophy. My obsession in life is how to think logically about big, important issues. And I don't know of a bigger, more important issue than energy, because energy is the industry that powers every other industry. So if you get energy right, energy is cheap, plentiful, and reliable, and that makes everything in life cheap, plentiful, and reliable. And if you get energy wrong, energy becomes expensive and scarce and unreliable, and everything else in life becomes expensive, scarce, and unreliable. Whether that's traveling by a plane or even something like food, if you get energy policy wrong, people suffer and people die. And I had this realization about 10 years ago how important energy was. And when I started looking at the discussion over energy, I became very disenchanted with how it was being conducted. So there are kind of three basic things that bothered me about the energy discussion. The first is I found it extremely biased. And above all, it was biased against fossil fuels and nuclear power. So whenever people would talk about fossil fuels and nuclear power, they would only talk about negative things. So for example, with coal, people would talk about how, hey, coal mining is so dangerous, look at all the poor coal workers, it's dirty, etc. But then when they would talk about solar and wind, they would only talk about positives. But that's biased. And when I looked into it, I noticed, hey, wait a second, solar and wind involve mining that's a lot more dangerous per unit of energy than in coal. So why aren't they talking about that? So even before I knew all the facts about fossil fuels, or a lot of the facts about fossil fuels, I knew that there was a bias in the way we're looking at it. You can't have a discussion where you only look at the negatives of one thing and the positives of another. The next thing I noticed was that our discussion of energy is sloppy, or for those of you who don't know that word, careless or messy. So, for example, people aren't very, very careful about their thinking. So, one example is whenever we're thinking about something, we want to think about both sides, positives and negatives. But we also need to identify them. We need to identify the magnitude very carefully. And I noticed that when people would talk about what they call climate change, when they talk about the impact of CO2, they would just say very vague things like climate change is real. But they wouldn't be clear, do you mean mild warming or massive warming? Do you mean a sea level rise of 2 feet in 100 years, like the UN talks about, or 20 feet in a few decades, like Al Gore talks about? Those make a big difference, because it could be that even if CO2 was causing warming, the warming would be a lot less significant than the energy we would lose by reducing access to fossil fuels. Whereas if it's as disastrous as Gore said, maybe we do have to take urgent action. So we can't get to the right answer unless we're both unbiased, or as unbiased as we can be, and also we have to be careful about the magnitudes of the positives and negatives. And then the third thing, which I think is the most important, is that our discussion of energy is anti-human. It doesn't truly value human life. And you might think, well, that's offensive to the discussion. I mean, doesn't everyone value human life? And the answer is no. To value human life in a decision-making process, we really have to hold human life as the standard by which we make our decisions. We have to say with every decision, is this really advancing human life or not? And how much? And when I looked at the energy discussion, it was not measuring things in terms of human life. So I'll give you the example of the climate issue. You'd have people say, oh, I care about climate change, I care about CO2, because it's harmful to human life. And yet those same opponents of fossil fuels would oppose the two best forms of energy that are non-carbon, nuclear power and hydropower. So the people who say they care the most about CO2 emissions are the people who hate the two practical ways of reducing them the most. So what's going on there? Well, if you look into their arguments, you notice, you ask, well, why is nuclear so bad? And they'll say, oh, it's unsafe, I really care about safety. I say, great, let's look at the data. If we rank technologies from most safe to least safe, which is the safest technology ever invented? Nuclear power, by a long shot. So, and if you look into the physics and engineering of it, this is quite straightforward why this is. And so it's obviously not safety, it's not a serious concern with human safety. So you ask, well, what's going on? And they'll start to say, well, we're just playing with God, it's unnatural, so you start to get that feel of it. And then you ask with hydroelectric power, what's going on there? Why is it you oppose hydroelectric power? And they'll say, well, we need free-flowing rivers. It's unnatural to dam rivers. So wait a second, you're saying CO2 is the biggest problem in the world, and you're not willing to dam a river to help solve it. You're not willing to split an atom to help solve it. What's going on? Well, what's going on is that the standard that we're using in our energy discussion is not human life. It's being green. And being green, and I hope this offends people because it's really important to think about what being green means. Being green is not a pro-human standard, because being green means minimizing human impact. So if we want to minimize human impact, then, well, that means that we shouldn't industrialize, we shouldn't use technology, we shouldn't develop, we never should have built New York City, you should never have a child. And ultimately, North Korea is a much greener country than South Korea, if you look in terms of human impact. So in my philosophy, I measure things by human life. I want to maximize human flourishing, which is the full flowering of human life. I don't want to minimize human impact. So my view is, unless we're committed in our thinking to be unbiased, to be careful, and to be pro-human, we're going to get the wrong answers. And because the debate was biased and sloppy and anti-human, I had no idea what the right answers were. So my interest became figure that out. If I look at energy from a pro-human perspective and think about it carefully, then what is the truth going to be about fossil fuels? So that's the method that I'm thinking about energy with, and that's what I think is the heart of my conclusion. Now, a little bit more on this idea of being green and why I oppose it. So the view of, if you ask us, why should we minimize our impact on nature? Why is this a good idea? I think the underlying idea that's going on there is that the planet is basically perfect without us. So I call this the perfect planet premise. And there are basically three ideas. Nature without us is stable, it's safe, and it's sufficient. So it's got this delicate balance to it. It's not going to threaten us with these horrible hurricanes like we have now, and it'll basically give us what we need. And if that's true, human beings are really just polluters and parasites. We're a blight on the earth, and the earth would be better off without us. But if we're going to live on Earth, what we should do is we should just minimize our impact, we should change as little as possible, and we should just feed off the Earth and be grateful to the rest of nature. And I think it's this idea that is throughout our whole culture, that we're just polluters and parasites, we're really sinners against the Earth, and we should just reduce our sin. And that if we do that, somehow we can live in harmony with nature and thrive. Now, there's only one problem with this view, which is that it's completely wrong. So the actual nature of nature is it's not stable, it's dynamic. It's not safe, it's dangerous, and it's surely not sufficient, it's deficient. That's why human beings had a life expectancy of 30 for, 100,000 years plus, because nature doesn't give us the good life that we need. We need to create it. So I think of human beings as we're perfecters of the earth. We make it better. We're producers. Now, that doesn't mean that everything we do is good, but it means that our general direction is to make the earth a better place to live. So people talk about how horrible our environment is, but I submit that if you take any rational human being from 300 years ago, if you could bring them in a time machine to today, and you ask them who has a better environment, you or us, they would laugh at you because it's so obvious how our environment is so much better if you look at environment by a human standard, not an anti-human standard. So I just want to be very open about where I'm coming from, and I think we need to examine our views on our method of thinking. Do we want to minimize human impact, or do we want to maximize human flourishing? Because if you want to minimize human impact, then you really want to minimize human presence on the planet. And I'll agree that if you want to minimize human impact, fossil fuels are bad. But I believe if you want to maximize human flourishing, fossil fuels used intelligently are absolutely essential, and we should be using more of them. So here's the project. Using a pro-human method of thinking, we want to look at the unique benefits of fossil fuels and also the unique risks about fossil fuels. And we want to be as precise and unbiased as we can get. So I'm going to start off with the unique benefits. Now this is a cartoon that captures a popular idea that is basically the idea that there are no unique benefits to fossil fuels. That everything that fossil fuels can do can be replaced pretty readily by so-called green energy. So the idea in this cartoon is we don't have to worry about the costs of reducing CO2 emissions because there are no costs, there are only benefits. So the idea is even if there's not a climate catastrophe, it's still good to pursue fossil fuel elimination. That's only going to improve our lives because we're going to get all of these different benefits, from rainforests to livable cities. And I think we should be very suspicious of this view. Just looking at the trajectory of energies. In 1980, I picked 1980 because that's the year I was born. And when I researched the 70s and 80s in terms of energy thinking, I saw people saying, hey, guess what? We're going to soon replace fossil fuels with solar and wind. And you can see what happened is my parents' generation, the generation of many of you in here, instead of reducing their fossil fuel use, overall, fossil fuel use dramatically increased. And I don't think it makes much sense, or it's very plausible, to attribute this to some conspiracy theory, like somehow everyone in the world just is continuing to decide to use fossil fuels, which not only grew quickly here, but are still in absolute terms the fastest growing form of energy in the world. I don't think it's plausible that it's just some conspiracy or it's something that can easily be replaced. I think that we should suspect that there's something about fossil fuels that make us use them, and there are certain unique benefits that we should really be afraid of losing. And with energy, if you lose benefits, again, that makes everything worse because energy is the industry that powers every other industry. So there's a video that I saw about 17 years ago where Jimmy Fallon, who's actually anti-fossil fuels, made this really, really good case against the renewables are free position, although I don't think he realized it. I know he didn't realize it. And this is in my book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. I give the exact quotes of it, but the basic idea is he said, he announced a new form of renewable energy in the news when he was covering the news. But it wasn't solar energy or wind energy, it was a promising form of energy called hazelnut energy. So the idea is, New Scientist magazine reported today that cars in the future could be powered by hazelnuts. And he said, well, that's great because, a jar this big costs $9. And so what's next? We're going to power cars by bald eagle heads or Fabergé eggs. And so the idea is this form of energy is obviously impractical because it's so costly. But wait a second, isn't it renewable energy? And Al Gore tells us renewable energy is free and forever because it comes from the sun. And so what's the fallacy here? The fallacy here is that you can't judge forms of energy by just looking at one element of the process. Energy is a very resource-intense process. And to understand the benefits and costs of different forms of energy, we need to compare the processes. We need to look at every element. We can't be biased and just look at, hey, the sun is free, but not look at, say, the cost of disposing of solar panels or the cost of just generating reliable energy. So speaking of reliable energy, one case that I studied, I looked for, okay, if we look at the current state of the art, what's supposedly the best example of solar and wind in action? And I was told, well, Germany, because it's one of the leaders in solar, it's one of the leaders in wind. It's invested hundreds of billions of dollars at least in these kinds of technologies, and you often hear very glowing reports of what's going on. So I started looking into it, and then I saw, well, wait a second, and fortunately I have my researcher happens to live in Germany, so he could give me a lot of first-hand reporting, but he showed me the data, and wait a second, Germany pays 3 to 4 times for electricity what we do in the US, and those costs have gone up, their prices have doubled since they started adding solar and wind, even though those are supposedly free and forever. So what's going on there? So then I contacted basically the European Electricity Board and paid them a bunch of money because I wanted to see what's going on the grid minute by minute, as close as I could get. And this is a summary of that data, where you basically see that at certain times you're getting a decent amount of electricity from solar and wind, and certain times you're getting virtually none. Well, if you're getting virtually none, if you can't rely on it, what does that mean? That means that you have to have 100% backup. So really, it's not a backup, it's life support. So what happens is the solar and wind becomes parasitical. It relies on the reliable energy, and that's why it inevitably adds a lot of cost. So people can talk about, well, we can solve this different ways, but the fact is, these are not solved problems, they're massive costs, and people are being very, very dishonest about them. And if they're dishonest about them, if they're careless in reporting the actual facts about these technologies, they're going to make people make very, very bad decisions. So the idea that solar and wind are good replacements for fossil fuels at this stage is a really, really dangerous lie. And we should not perpetrate it, we should not fall for it, and we should not in any way support it in the name of being green, in the name of, oh, solar and wind are somehow natural. Like, I don't care where my energy comes from, I just want it to be the best energy for human life. And we'll look at some of the costs of fossil fuels in a second, but it doesn't matter whether it comes from sunlight or it comes from splitting the atom, it needs to be the best overall. And unreliable energy is not a good source of energy. So I think the proper way to classify solar and wind is not renewables, it's unreliables. And I think that's something that we should really talk about. And I think people are afraid to say that because they're afraid to alienate the idea of being green. But we shouldn't even be talking about being green, we should talk about being human. And to reinforce how much this matters, there are 1.2 billion people in the world without electricity. So every penny we add to the price of electricity is harming these people's lives. It lessens their chance to move forward. And then more broadly, if you look at what people are doing for cooking and heating their homes, you have 2.7 billion people who are using biomass, which means wood or dung. So you have people right now who are suffering, who need the rest of the world to figure out the absolute most affordable ways to produce energy. And so by any kind of distortion that we have against energy that they can afford is deadly to them, and it's incredibly irresponsible. So we're about to now cover the concerns about fossil fuels, because obviously that's crucial to cover if we want to know the big picture. But it's worth saying that given that the fossil fuel industry has a unique ability at this stage to produce cheap, plentiful, reliable energy on a scale of billions, so I think it's the only industry that has that kind of process and will for the foreseeable future. I think the closest is nuclear, but the Greens are attacking nuclear even more viciously than they attack fossil fuels. So we should be liberating everything, but in terms of the evidence, the fossil fuel industry is the only industry in history that has figured out how to produce cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for billions of people. And I think even if there are costs, and we'll talk about them, I think we should be really grateful to the people who've done this. And I think it's really offensive that we say things like, oh, I hate fossil fuels. Now, I was flying in yesterday on Avianca, and I was thinking today about, well, what if there had been someone on the plane who had gone to the pilot and said, you know what, I think what you do is evil. I think the pilot is evil. And then they were wearing an I hate pilots shirt. And they just spent their whole life denouncing pilots. What would you say to them? You'd probably say, get off the damn plane. And the pilot would probably kick them off. Because what kind of person are you that you're taking advantage of this amazing human being that's allowing you to fly? And then you're saying, oh, I hate you. I want to destroy you. Well, how is it any different to do that to the pilot than to do it to the person who fuels the plane or the person who created the fuel? There's only one industry that allows us to fly. It's the fossil fuel industry. And we tell the industry, hey, we want to do the most amazing thing ever. We want to fly, right? We want to be magic. We want to fly from one point to another point incredibly fast. And only one industry raised its hand and said, yeah, we figured out a way to do that. And then we say, we hate you, you're horrible. The earth would be better off without you. I think the earth would be better off without the people who say that. So the fossil fuel industry is doing something incredible for our lives. And even if there are problems, and big problems, we should still be grateful for it. And if we need to transition away from them soon, then that would be a tragedy. So far I haven't proven that we should transition away from them rapidly. I'm just saying, I have proven, though, that that would be a tragedy. We should be mourning it. It should be sad. It would be the same thing as if tomorrow, if we had to immediately transition away from antibiotics. Like there are challenges with antibiotics, and you said, well, nobody can use antibiotics, or we really have to quickly get off. 100%, like it's undoubtedly true that lots and lots of people would die if we did that. So even if it was on balance necessary, it would be a tragedy. So it would be a tragedy to need to lose fossil fuels. And so if we don't recognize that as a culture, we're not thinking about it carefully, and I don't think we're thinking about it in a pro-human way. Because I almost see nothing in our newspapers about 3 billion people having very little energy. But I see things all the time about, this storm, or that storm, or this is CO2 is bad in this way. So there's just it's not really concerned with human beings. It's not measuring things by human life. So if we are going to consider restrictive policies, there's a very high burden of proof. So let's now think about the concerns that we have about fossil fuels. So the three are catastrophic resource depletion, catastrophic pollution, and catastrophic climate change. I'm going to cover each of these. I want to focus on climate change because it's the biggest concern these days. But this is a good chance to point out, not only do you have pins at your table, but there are cards. And the purpose of the cards is for me to be able to send you more resources that you can learn more about this and that you can send things to your friends. I have the videos of me at that protest if you're interested, but also a lot of other stuff. So if you just put your email there, then you will get those resources and more about this. Let me give you the high level on it. So with resources, one thing that I found fascinating studying the history of resources is that the more hydrocarbons we use, the more hydrocarbons we have. So that's not what we would expect because we hear, oh, it's non-renewable, it's a big problem. So what's going on here? And the key here is that we need to make a distinction between a potential resource and an actual resource. So the world is full. The world is just all potential resources. A resource is just something that if we use human ingenuity, we can make it valuable. Like aluminum used to not be a resource, and then we made it a resource. Coal wasn't a resource, we made it a resource. Oil wasn't a resource, we made it a resource. So the world is full of potential resources. And with hydrocarbons, they used to not be a resource at all. And in the last 150 years, really 300 years if you include coal, what we've done is we've taken a huge amount of hydrocarbon potential resource and we've turned just a little bit of it into a resource. And we keep doing more and more of that faster than we use it. So the way human beings work is we're not parasites on Earth. We create resources by turning potential resources into actual resources. So we shouldn't be worried about, oh, we're going to run out of this form of energy, because there's a huge amount more potential resource. And also, if that isn't the best way to do it, we can turn all sorts of other things into energy, like uranium or the sun or the wind, whenever we can do those efficiently. So we're not causing catastrophic resource depletion, we're causing very positive resource creation. Now what about pollution, contamination? Well, in terms of the water issue, and I was reading a little bit about Peru and water issues. So the fact about water is that, in general, as we've used more fossil fuels around the world, water quality has gotten better. Now that could just be a correlation, but there is a strong cause there, which is that energy cleans water. Nature doesn't give us the clean water that we need. We need to move water from where it is to where we need it, which takes a lot of energy, and we need to take impure water and make it pure. So when we have cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, it does that. So when any country is contemplating different problems with water, what it has to look at is, do we have enough energy? And then also, do we have enough other technology? But technology is the key to having clean water, including energy technology. So using fossil fuels is compatible with having amazingly clean water, and it in fact brought us amazingly clean water. Now what about air quality? Well, there are a couple of things here. One is that that nature doesn't give us good air quality either, because it doesn't give us much in terms of what we need, because the default form of energy for keeping us warm is fire. So that means people by default are breathing in lots and lots of smoke from outdoor fires or indoor fires. And so what human beings have done is we've created all sorts of technology to make our fuel much less of the byproduct get into our lungs. And what this graph here shows is that in the United States, we've been using more fossil fuels, but we have lower levels of these different kinds of emissions. So this shows that it's not that there aren't air pollution problems anymore, but it shows that those problems are solvable with technology. So having a lot of resources and having clean air and clean water, those are problems that are solvable by technology and only solvable by technology. So those should be our focus. If we have policies that make energy more expensive, that's not going to help anything. Now, I mentioned I want to spend the most time on climate. Now, we use this term climate change, which I think is a really bad term, because climate change isn't good or bad, leaving aside how much man-made it is. Change is just change. And let's say it's man-made climate change, that's not bad either. It's only bad if it's bad for human life. So what I'm concerned about is not climate change, but climate danger. And ultimately what I want positively is I want climate livability. So when we look at fossil fuels, we need to look at how does using fossil fuels affect the livability of our climate. And I think there are three things we need to look at. One is the greenhouse effect. That's the warming impact of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Two is the fertilizer effect. That's the plant growing impact of CO2. And then the third is the protection effect, which is how does having more affordable energy allow us to protect ourselves from climate by building a more durable civilization. So what's the overall balance of these things? I'll get into each one, but we have a really good statistic for measuring climate livability at any given time. And this statistic is called climate-related deaths. They total up, there's an international agency, nonpartisan, they total up deaths from extreme heat, extreme cold, flood, storms, wildfires, all different sorts of climate-related disasters. Now, before I looked at this data, I suspected that these were getting worse, but I thought they weren't. That problem wasn't nearly as big as the problem you'd get by restricting fossil fuels. But it turned out I was completely wrong. Because it turns out that as we've used more fossil fuels, climate-related deaths have plummeted. To give you some data points, in the 1930s, which is, I think, when we first have any kind of decent data, there are several years in which, adjusted for population today, you have 10 million climate-related deaths a year. Now last year, this is globally, last year, which we hear in the news is the worst year ever for our planet, there were 6,114 climate-related deaths. 6,114. So what has happened? Well, the basic thing that's happened is that we've used energy and technology to take our naturally dangerous climate and make it safe. And that the CO2 we've emitted has been inconsequential in comparison to that energy and technology. So let's look at that in detail. So we look at the greenhouse effect. We hear about the greenhouse effect, but we need to be precise about what it is. Most people, when people talk about it, they don't know or don't realize or don't convey that this is a diminishing effect, which means every new molecule leads to less warming than the last. So what we would expect then is that adding more CO2 to the atmosphere, all things being equal, would cause some warming, but not catastrophic warming. But I don't have any problem with some warming, I have a problem with catastrophic warming. So if that's the case, then it's not a big concern. It might even be positive. Generally, people want it to be warmer, not cooler. Now, if we look at the historical context, what we can see is that CO2, two things. One, CO2 doesn't seem to be the primary driver of temperature, and also that CO2 is at a historically very low level today, and that temperature is at a very low level today. So I would be more afraid of going down than going up on this kind of thing. Now, to put it in more context, you hear about, oh, this is the warmest year ever, it's so warm. Well, that's a misleading statement to say it's the warmest year ever, because even since before we started using fossil fuels, it was getting warmer, but it was getting warmer slowly, and it's been getting warmer since we started using fossil fuels a little less slowly, a little faster, but not anywhere near at the rate we'd expect just from the CO2. So we could already be on, so think of it like gaining weight. So if I'm gaining 1/100th of 1 pound a year, you could say this is my fattest year ever, right? It's my fattest year ever, but that doesn't mean I have a weight problem. I'm gaining at 1/100th a year. So it's important to be precise about things. Mild warming is not a justification for reducing fossil fuel use. Now, some people do claim, many people do claim, that we're going to have massive warming, but that's not because they can prove it by looking at the greenhouse effect. It's because they've created simulations that add a lot of other variables that are much more speculative. And I'm only inclined to believe simulations to the extent that they can make real predictions, meaningful predictions, and so far our ability to simulate climate hasn't. So we should definitely try to do that, but we should definitely look into other forms that are more accurate instead of just continually making aggressive, exaggerated predictions. Now, the second effect, besides the greenhouse effect, so I think the greenhouse effect is mild and manageable. It's real, but it's mild and manageable. The second effect is the fertilizer effect, and that is the plant growth effect of CO2. And notice that this is never discussed, almost never discussed. Even though supposedly people are so concerned about plant life, they talk about being green, but nobody's interested in global greening when it comes from fossil fuels. But this is a huge, huge impact, because basically what CO2 is doing is it's improving the climate of our plants, who are much more sensitive to climate than we are, because plants don't have technology, right? So it's giving us all of this plant growth, which has all sorts of benefits. So it's just completely wrong to ignore this. So it seems like a pretty significant impact. Now, one thing about warming that you might be particularly concerned about is sea level rise. So sea level rise is another issue where technology is really, really important. We need to look into different ways to do that, because sea level rise is always going to be an issue somewhere. If you notice here, these are the sea level rise trends. And what these trends show is that sea level rise or fall is mostly local. Some places it rises quickly, some places it falls quickly. It's mostly local factors. So we need to get technology. It's not just, oh, if we stopped using oil, somehow sea level rise won't be an issue. And to put it in context, sea level rise is really slow right now compared to what it's been just 10 or 20,000 years ago. This is from Wikipedia, which is an extremely anti-fossil fuel, I would say, biased website. So here's my conclusion. Given the unique positives of fossil fuels, which are extremely underrated, and the unique negatives, which are extremely exaggerated, or even in some cases they might be positives, like global greening, there's a strong moral case for using more fossil fuels, not less. Now, my goal today is not that you're 100% convinced, because you should certainly look into my arguments and think about this, but I hope I've given you a way of thinking that, and a challenge, the conventional way of thinking, that's at least good enough to look into, because this is an issue where there's a lot of popular opinion on one side, and that can feel safe. But I never feel safe when I'm on the side of popular opinion unless I've really investigated, because sometimes popular opinion is right, and sometimes it's wrong. And sometimes it's really, really wrong. In history, think about popular opinion for a long time was that slavery was okay. In different places, it was that racism is okay. And both of those claims were justified by misuses of science and by people claiming that they were right and that science was on their side. Same thing for eugenics, forced sterilization. There's a lot of things that popular opinion is wrong about. And we like to look to the past and think, well, I would have been one of those people who protested when things were going wrong. I would have stood up. And statistically, the truth is, no, you wouldn't have. No, we wouldn't have, right? Because most people didn't. So how do we know that we're doing the right thing, that we're putting ourselves in a position to figure out whether we're right or not? And my answer is the only thing we can do is learn how to think independently about the issue. We have to have a clear method of thinking about things, and we have to apply it. So in my case, what I'm trying to do is say, okay, I'm clear on my standard, it's human life, and then I'm clear, I'm going to be as unbiased and careful as possible at looking at the alternatives. It doesn't guarantee I'm right, but it at least gives me a much better chance. So I'd urge everyone to do the same thing. So I want to jump to the end because I'm really eager to hear everyone's questions. So I just encourage everyone, if you find these ideas interesting, please fill out your card. I'll be around a little bit, so feel free to also come up to me. But if you find this intriguing, fortunately, over the last 10 years, I've been able to create a lot of stuff. And particularly, if you find it interesting, please share it with other people. So I want to give you the resources necessary to do that. So to my last point, it's, when I made these comparisons to the past about really bad ideas in the past, I think energy is this big a deal again, because energy is the industry that powers every other industry. So my contention is we're thinking in a very, very bad way about something that matters to 7 billion people. So I hope I've given you a different way of thinking about it, and I hope you take it seriously, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Una pregunta. En el último Perumín, uno de los defensores de que hay que hacer algo para evitar el cambio climático dice que el clima ha subido 1.1 grados. Y que, bueno, como ha subido 1.1 grados, si llegara a subir 2 grados, sería irreversible, que la naturaleza continuaría levantando el...
All right, okay, I got the question. So it's referencing a popular, hold on, I'm hearing my own translation. There's a popular statistical claim that 2 degrees Celsius is a point of disaster, sometimes called a tipping point or a point of no return for the planet. And the term that was used was irreversible. So, I mentioned at the beginning that there's these 2 ways of thinking about the planet. The perfect planet, and then the perfectible planet. So the perfect planet says it's just the climate and everything else is in this very perfect, stable way, and all we can do is ruin it. And the perfectible planet says it's not nearly good enough and we have to change a lot of things. So I believe that 2 degrees Celsius, and I believe the perfect planet idea is a religion, because there's no scientific basis for viewing a planet as our mother, you know, which is the mother nature kind of view. So I showed historically, I guess I have this. Yeah, so if we look at history, to say 2 degrees, look at the variation there, to say 2 degrees Celsius is this magic number. This number was just come up with as a public relations thing. Now think about it, it's 2 degrees, how perfect is that? That the exact right number is exactly 2. It's complete nonsense. What you would need to be able to show is that there's something that's very harmful to human beings, because the warming is proceeding at a very high, it's accelerating at a high rate. So we should be open to that kind of thing. We shouldn't be closed to the possibility, but I don't believe that there's any evidence of that, and I don't expect that, since CO2 has diminishing warming. Now, one point from a human point of view, when people talk about irreversible, here's what I think is irreversible. When somebody's life ends early, that's irreversible, right? When people suffer when they could have been enjoying their lives, that's irreversible. So every action has irreversible consequences, but I wish people would worry a little bit more about irreversible human lives than irreversible 2 degrees Celsius.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. What I understand from what you explained is that green energy may not be necessarily bad and may have a positive contribution, but one has to make an assessment of what it means. That's the first thing. And the second thing, what you're saying is we cannot get rid of fossil fuels. We must use them because they are good for many other people that still need them. Is that what you basically are saying?
Not exactly for both, but so let me clarify a little bit. I don't think green is desirable, because green means little impact. You can talk about clean. That's better, because clean means has lower harmful waste. That's okay. Although there's no perfectly clean energy, and fossil fuels are much cleaner than people think. But the real thing that we want is we want life-enhancing energy. We want the best energy overall for human life. So not just clean, but cheap, plentiful, reliable, safe. I think those are the biggest four: cheap, plentiful, reliable, safe. So we shouldn't think of the goal as being green energy. The goal should just be we want better energy. We have no idea where that will come from. Now, solar and wind, notice the thing they have in common right now is that they're unreliable right now. So we shouldn't aspire to solar and wind. We shouldn't aspire to, we certainly shouldn't aspire to green, and we shouldn't aspire to renewable either. Renewable basically just means that the raw energy source will naturally replenish. But I don't care whether something is renewable, I care whether it's the best. So if solar energy can be used for 5 billion years and is unreliable for 5 billion years or is not the best, why do I want to use it? I only want to use it when it's the best. It's just like with my phone. I don't want a renewable cell phone. I don't want a cell phone made of all renewable materials. I want it made of the best materials. And then human beings will figure out better and better ways. So human progress is not renewable, it's not sustainable, it's evolving. So what we want is we want the best energy, which means evolving energy. Now the second, that was green. And then the second point about is fossil fuels for poor people. Well, fossil fuels are the best energy for most people now. And they've made poor people much wealthier. So everyone should use the best energy for them. So for the poorest people, it's the most necessary because they're going from none to some. But it matters for everyone. Like, I really need a lot of fossil fuels. And I like to go on the plane and all sorts of other stuff. And I want to use more of them in various ways when it benefits my life. So it especially benefits the poor, but benefits everyone. I certainly don't want to be my life ruined with unreliable energy. Sorry.
Hi. This is the first time probably I heard the opposite and el discurso opuesto for what we're being used to. We all the time we're listening on media or press or everywhere that green is good, and you are the only person that says the opposite. So what's the missing link? Why is the media or the NGOs or everyone else is wrong in your perspective? And why aren't they listening to you in order to improve human quality life?
So, yeah, I'm going against most people, so why do I think I'm right and then why do they disagree? So my background is, I'm a philosopher. My obsession is thinking clearly about everything. So if I have a goal, I follow it, I want to define it, and I want to follow it like a computer program. My other thing I studied was computer science. I just want to have it exact. And in our culture, that's very, very rare. People will say very vague things that feel good in some way, and they won't be clear about what it means in action. And the way it works is people who want bad things, they'll use a very vague term that combines good things and bad things. So the idea of green minimizing impact, well, I want to minimize my impact as in I want to minimize air pollution and I want to minimize water contamination. But I don't think of it as minimizing impact because I want to also build buildings, right? I want to develop land, I want to produce energy, I want to be able to visit places. So minimizing impact, it's packaging together something good and something bad. So if you want to promote something bad, you package it with something good because people think, oh, in order to be for clean air and clean water, I need to be against development. But those are separate. So by being for humans, I can be anti-pollution and pro-development. So I think that clarity is very uncommon, but I find that when I explain things clearly, it has a lot of impact. So I've been able to change a lot of people's minds. And one reason why I encourage everyone to fill out their cards, to share your email, to get information, is that I think these are ideas that spread very quickly. But I'm starting off, I started off, no one knew who I was. So I think there's a lot of potential, but I need a lot of help.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm married to a conservationist, and on Sunday we celebrated our 29th anniversary, and so probably I will not use your pin tonight when I arrive home, since I'm meant to celebrate the 30th anniversary. What I enjoyed the most of the presentation is that you presented something which is very different from what I've been accustomed to listening to. I don't think that green necessarily implies an extreme position of conservation, and it's not necessarily anti-human. It depends on the definition of green, so I'm not going to argue about definitions. You mentioned that a great contribution of fossil oils is cheap energy, available energy. And you mentioned Germany as an example of where the promotion of alternative energies has led to a very expensive energy. However, Germany is one of the leaders of the world in terms of its economy, especially in Europe. So I think that you should also analyze that. Now, promoting those type of energies and using those type of energies actually does not lead you to this economic disaster or evolution.
Okay. Important issue. So I'll start with Germany and then maybe say something about green. So you mentioned I didn't mention Germany's overall economic status. I just mentioned what had happened in their energy industry and what that had done to prices. And that's because whenever you're dealing with an economy as a whole, it's a very complex system. And energy has an impact on it, but many other things have an impact on it, including just the historical presence of industries, which can also include past cheaper energy, which kind of influenced it. And so to get an idea of what difference the energy is making, the first thing I want to know is what did it do to the affordability of energy? Because imagine if it multiplied it by 2, it's very hard to, now I know they passed on a lot of it to their consumers because their industry has a lot of pull, but I don't see how you can make the argument that it's helped Germany to have electricity that's twice as expensive, and in fact for the consumers it's hurt them a lot. They now use the term energy poverty very frequently. It's become a part of the national vocabulary where it wasn't before. So it's been a negative, but they have other positive things going on. The same token, if you cut off 2 of LeBron James's fingers, he would still be a really, really good basketball player, but you wouldn't recommend people cutting off their fingers. In terms of being green, and I don't want to invite any kind of marital strife, but I think it's important when we think about our philosophy of environment to think about what is our principle. So if your principle isn't minimizing impact, what is it? Is it, because if I say, okay, I want to maximize human flourishing, that includes having a good environment, and it might mean preserving the most beautiful things, but also transforming a lot of other things. But if people just say, well, I'm green or I'm a conservationist in general, how do you do that in a way that it doesn't harm humans? So I think it's important to define our principles, and when somebody gives me a principle that when I follow it consistently leads to destruction, I don't use that principle.
I've just been told that this is the last question, and I'm not willing to destroy Wales' marriage with my own loop. So, I'm sorry, as a Keynesian you are, I'm going to have to answer. Just a minute ago, someone was answering why the press is never talking about these things and why the press doesn't have this approach to this huge problem. And maybe, I'm a journalist, and maybe it's because of how the process works here in our countries, I mean in Hispanic countries. not in terms of turning fuel into energy, but how do we get the fuel? And that's, in my opinion, mainly because the fuel is almost in every occasion underground, and our property system works under the premises that the state owns whatever richness is below the surface line. So basically, the difference between a guy who finds oil in Texas and a guy who finds oil in Peru is that if a Texan finds oil in his backyard, he's immediately rich. If a Peruvian finds oil in his backyard, he's immediately poor, because the state is going to own his land. And I think we can have a very academic and a very high-level discussion about the way economics and public policy works. But I think the main concern of press is translating information into the people, and we are lacking and we're not having the way to deliver politically the message of the importance of the fuel and every fossil resources to the people, because they're not getting their share, because their share is getting straight to our state, and they are building pools in districts which have no water. So that's quite a bit hard to understand for people in the Andes or in the Amazon region. I, by the way, agree with everything you've said. The problem here, I think, it's not in science or in public policy or in public policy and sampling. It's just in politics and the state.
Those are really interesting thoughts, and most of the issues you talk about, I don't have any expertise on, so hopefully, but I think that should be interesting to everyone here. One thing I want to observe is that when we talk about media being against fossil fuels, this is a global phenomenon. So whatever Peru, and the phenomenon of government-owned underground resources, in my view, which I'm against, that's in every country besides the United States. So that may be a factor, but even in the United States, we have a tremendous amount of anti-fossil fuel sentiment. So I think what's going on is just that there's a movement, the green movement, that's taking a legitimate concern, which is clean air and clean water, anti-pollution, and it's packaging that with an anti-human concern, which is anti-development and anti-technology, and that they have done a good job at making you feel like if you're against them, then you're for pollution. And what we need to do then is we need to challenge that idea and then have a new movement that's pro-human, including anti-pollution and pro-development. So I call this the human flourishing movement. That's the term I like to use, human flourishing, which means human beings living to their full potential in every aspect of life. So with that, once again, if you haven't filled out your cards, I hope that you do, and I hope I get to talk to some of you later. And thank you very much to Anthony and his whole team for having me. It was very interesting speaking here and visiting here. Thank you.